The morning Ella Beckett turned 36, nobody in Harlan's Crossing bothered to bake her a cake, and she had long since stopped expecting one. She stood at the window of her dry goods store as the sun crept over the ridge of the San Andres Mountains, painting the dusty main street of Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico territory, in shades of amber and rose. The year was 1882, and the town was the kind of place that aged its people quickly. The wind off the desert was merciless, the work was ceaseless, and the social arithmetic was ruthless in the way only small frontier towns could manage. Ella had done the arithmetic herself, many times in the quiet hours before dawn. 36. No husband, no children, a dry goods store that she had built from the bones of her father's hardware business after he passed 3 winters ago. She had flour and nails and lengths of calico fabric and a reputation as the most reliable woman in the county, and she had made her peace with the notion that these things would have to be enough. Or rather, she had tried to make that peace. Some mornings the peace held better than others. She pulled her dark hair back and pinned it with practiced efficiency, then unlocked the front door of Beckett's Dry Goods and let the desert morning rush in. The street smelled of horses and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the mesquite blooming somewhere beyond the edge of town. A roadrunner darted across the road and vanished beneath the boardwalk of the saloon opposite, and Ella watched it go with a small, private smile she reserved for the living things that did not know they were supposed to behave any differently than they did. Martha Holt came by at 7:30, the way she always did, her basket hooked over one plump arm and her 3 children strung behind her like beads on a string. Martha was 28 and already looked comfortable in the life she had built, and she greeted Ella with genuine warmth and a look that Ella recognized without flinching, the look of a woman who felt a complicated mixture of affection and pity for someone who had been quietly reclassified as a permanent fixture rather than a participant. "Good morning, Ella. Have you heard? There's a man from Texas arrived last night. A cattle broker, they're saying, staying at Hewson's." "Is that so?" Ella said, lifting a bolt of blue gingham onto the counter and beginning to measure it out. "He rode in alone, big bay horse." Martha said this as though it were significant, and perhaps in Harlan's Crossing it was. Unattached men arriving in a town like this were always cause for a certain civic excitement, a reshuffling of social possibilities. Mrs. Garza said he took supper alone and didn't speak much to anyone. "I imagine he was tired from the ride," Ella said. Martha gave her a look that suggested Ella was being willfully obtuse. "He's not married, they say." "A great many men in this territory are not married," Ella said evenly. "That is generally because the territory makes it difficult to keep anyone alive long enough." She smiled to take the edge off the words, and Martha laughed, but the laugh had that soft, slightly uncomfortable quality it always had when Ella said something that was truthful in a way that reminded people of the life she was actually living rather than the one they imagined she ought to want. Ella finished measuring the gingham, wrapped it in brown paper, and sent Martha off with her children and her basket and her cheerful matrimonial arithmetic. Then she stood for a moment behind her counter and looked at the wall where she kept her ledger books and the framed photograph of her father, a stern, weathered man with kind eyes who had taught her to count stock before she could write her name, and she straightened her shoulders and got on with the morning. The stranger came in at 10 o'clock. She heard his boots on the boardwalk before she saw him, a particular weight to each step, not the shuffling of a man unsure of himself, but the deliberate tread of someone who had been walking long distances over rough ground for long enough that it had become simply the way he moved through the world. He pushed open her door and ducked his head slightly against the lintel, which told her he was taller than the door was built for, and then he straightened and looked around her store with the focused, unhurried attention of a man doing serious inventory. He was broad-shouldered and sun-browned, with dark hair that was slightly too long and eyes the particular pale gray-green of sage after rain. He wore a plain canvas shirt, well-used leather boots, and a hat that had seen better decades. And there was about him a quality that Ella, who was accustomed to reading men the way she read her ledger books, identified almost immediately as genuine. Not the performed genuineness of a man who knew women found sincerity attractive, but the real article, a man who simply did not think to be anything other than what he was. He looked at her and nodded in the way men did when they were acknowledging the presence of a proprietor rather than performing a social introduction. "Morning, ma'am. I'm looking for fence wire, and also, if you have it, a good quality axle grease." "I have both," Ella said, moving from behind the counter. "How much wire?" 500 yards if you've got it. I'll take whatever you have and order the rest." She led him to the back section of the store where she kept the heavier goods and showed him what she had in stock. He hunkered down to examine the wire with the thoroughness of a man who had been sold inferior goods before and had decided to be careful thereafter. And while he was doing this, he said, without looking up, "I was told this was the best supplied store between here and Las Cruces." "Whoever told you that was either flattering me or had not been to Las Cruces recently," Ella said. "But I try to keep a good stock." He looked up at that, and she caught the edge of a smile, not the easy, practiced smile of a man deploying charm, but something more surprised, as though she had said something he had not expected, and he found he was glad she had said it. "Amos Donovan," he said, straightening and extending a hand. "Ella Beckett," she said, and shook it. His grip was firm without being demonstrative, and he held her hand exactly as long as a handshake required and no longer, and then released it and returned his attention to the wire. "I've taken on the Cañada land north of town," he said. "The Velasco parcel. I'll be setting up a cattle operation. There's a good deal of fencing to do before I bring any stock up." Ella knew the Velasco parcel. Everybody in Harlan's Crossing knew it, 800 acres of decent grazing land that had sat empty since old Luis Velasco had sold it 2 years ago and moved his family to Santa Fe. It was rough land mostly, with a spring-fed creek and a broken-down adobe house, and a lot of good grass that nobody had managed to put to use because setting it up properly required the kind of patient, sustained effort that speculative buyers rarely committed to. "That is a substantial undertaking," she said. "The house needs considerable work." "I know it," he said. "I looked it over yesterday before I made the offer." He paused. "You know the property." "I know most of the properties in this county," she said. "I supply half the people working them." She began making note of what he would need in her ledger, the wire, the grease, and a dozen other things she could anticipate a man setting up a cattle operation would require. "I can have the wire and grease ready this afternoon. Will you be needing timber?" "A good deal of it." "I can order it from the mill at Cruces. It comes in on the freight wagon, usually takes 8 to 10 days. She did not look up from her ledger. "If you give me a list of what you need, I can put the order in today." There was a brief pause, and then he said, "You are very organized." "I find that organization prevents most disasters," she said. "At least the ones that can be prevented." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and laid it on the counter. It was covered in neat, small handwriting, a list that was thorough and ordered, and showed that he had been thinking carefully about what this operation would require. Ella looked at it and felt the small, involuntary pleasure she always felt when she encountered genuine competence. It was, in her experience, one of the rarest things in the territory. "This is excellent," she said, meaning it. He looked slightly surprised again. "Most people tell me I overplan." "Those people have never had to order timber from the mill at Cruces," she said. He laughed. It was a good laugh, genuine and unhurried, and it changed his face in a way that made Ella look up from her ledger for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before she looked back down and made note of the order. That was the beginning of it, though she did not know it was the beginning of anything at all. He came in twice that week on account of the store, and both times they talked the way people talk when they are conducting business, but have found, to their mutual mild surprise, that they enjoy talking to each other. He told her he had been ranching in Texas, near Abilene, for 12 years, that he had sold his spread there when the drought and the cattle market combined to make the mathematics unworkable, and that he had ridden through New Mexico territory 3 years ago on a cattle drive, and had not been able to stop thinking about the Velasco land ever since. She told him about the store, about the freight schedules and the reliable suppliers and the ones who needed watching, and he listened the way she had rarely experienced a man listening with his full attention, as though the information was genuinely interesting to him, which perhaps it was, since it was information he would need. On the Friday of that first week, she helped him load his supplies into the wagon, a solid, practical rig pulled by 2 strong quarter horses, and he thanked her in the direct way he had, and then he said, "Miss Beckett, I want to be honest with you about something." She straightened and looked at him with the wariness of a woman who had heard that phrase precede several varieties of unwelcome news over the years. "All right," she said. "I am going to need a great deal from this store over the next 6 months, he said, "and I intend to pay my accounts on time and in full, but I also want to say that I appreciate the way you do business. It makes things easier." She felt the wary tension release, replaced by something warmer and more complicated. "Thank you," she said. "I try to make it easy for people who take their business seriously." He nodded and climbed up onto the wagon seat, and she stood on the boardwalk and watched him drive the team north toward the Velasco land, and she was aware, in a way she would not have admitted to Martha Holt for all the gingham in the territory, that she was watching him longer than the business transaction required. The town of Harlan's Crossing had its own opinion about Amos Donovan, which it formed and expressed with the comfortable efficiency of a community that had been doing this kind of work for years. By the end of his second week, the general consensus was that he was a solid, capable man with resources enough to make a go of the Velasco land, and therefore an eligible prospect. The women with unmarried daughters began recalibrating their domestic calendars to include more trips to the dry goods store, and the saloon conversation among the men involved a good deal of speculative commentary about what kind of hands he would be hiring and whether the cattle operation would be good for the local economy. Nobody thought to include Ella Beckett in this recalibration. It was not deliberate cruelty. They simply did not think of it. She was 36 years old and had been running her store alone for 3 years and had never, in the memory of the town, shown any indication of romantic interest in anyone, and the town had quietly, collectively, made up its mind that she had chosen her store the way a nun chooses a vocation, not as a substitute for something she could not have, but as a primary thing. They liked her. They respected her. They relied on her. They had simply and gently removed her from the ledger of romantic possibility, the way a good bookkeeper removes an account that is no longer active, without malice, and without any real consideration of whether the account itself had any opinion on the matter. Ella knew this. She had known it for a while. There was a particular quality to the town's collective attention, the way people spoke to her warmly, but without the specific warm speculation they directed at women they still considered to be in the arena of romantic life. She had accepted it the way she accepted the weather, as a condition of the landscape rather than something she had caused or could change. Amos Donovan had not been in Harlan's Crossing long enough to have absorbed this understanding. It was on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of his arrival that things shifted, though the shift was so quiet and so unexpected that Ella did not recognize it for what it was until much later, when she was lying awake in the darkness of her room above the store and thinking about the conversation with the unguarded, helpless attention that she generally tried to reserve for her ledger books. He came into the store at 8:30, when she was in the middle of rearranging her lamp oil inventory, which had been delivered incorrectly and needed sorting. She was on her knees behind the counter, pulling bottles and checking labels, and she heard the door and said, without looking up, "I'll be with you in a moment." "Take your time," he said, and then after a brief pause, "Miss Beckett, do you always do this kind of work yourself?" "I have one boy who helps with deliveries on Thursdays," she said. "For the rest, yes." You don't have anyone to help on a regular basis. She finished checking the last bottle and stood up, smoothing her skirt. I have not found it necessary. I am perfectly capable of organizing my own stock. I don't doubt that, he said, and there was no condescension in it, which was what she had braced for. I only meant it seems like a great deal of work for one person. It is, she agreed, but I like work. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that considering gaze of his that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. The way he looked at a fence line he was planning to repair, or a piece of wire he was assessing for quality. Not rude, just thorough. I brought your list back, he said. The timber order. I added a few things. She took the list and looked at it, and then she said, You added a window, 2 windows actually. The adobe needs light, he said. I figured. He stopped. What did you figure? She asked, not unkindly. I figured a house ought to have light, he said, even if it's just me in it. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in the way he said it, not self-pity, not any kind of appeal, just a plain statement of a plain belief that struck her as unexpectedly moving. A man in this territory who was building a house with windows, not because he needed them, but because a house ought to have light, was a man who had a particular relationship with the idea of home. I'll add the windows to the order, she said. Good quality glass, not the cheap stuff. It costs more, but it'll last. Good quality, he agreed. She added it to the ledger, and then, before she could think better of it, she said, How is the house coming along? Slowly, he said. There is more work than I anticipated, and I am doing most of it alone. The hands I hired are good with cattle, not with adobe. A slight pause. Would you? He stopped again. Would I what? I was going to ask if you would be willing to come and look at it sometime. You know building supplies and you know what's available locally. I'd value your opinion on what's needed. He said this plainly, as though it were a practical request, which she supposed it was. But I don't want to take up your time if you'd rather not. Ella thought of the town's quiet collective removal of her from the ledger of social life and felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest, not hope exactly, not at 36 years old, but the faint, surprised awareness of a possibility she had not expected to encounter. Saturday afternoon, she said. I close at noon on Saturdays. He nodded, and the edge of that smile appeared again. I'll bring a decent horse for you. I have my own horse, she said. Of course you do, he said, and the smile came all the way out this time, and she looked away quickly and made a note in her ledger that she did not entirely need to make. She rode out to the Velasco land on Saturday afternoon and spent 2 hours walking around the adobe house and the outbuildings with Amos Donovan, and the 2 hours were the most straightforwardly pleasant she had spent in longer than she cared to account for. He had made a start on the exterior repairs, fresh mud plaster on the worst sections of the walls, new timber framing on the sagging stable roof, and he had a good eye for structural problems and knew which ones were urgent and which could wait. She told him about the lumber supplier in Cruces who gave better rates if you ordered in bulk, and the adobe specialist in Doña Ana County who was worth the cost if you needed proper foundation work. And he listened and asked good questions and treated her knowledge as valuable rather than surprising. They sat on the low stone wall of the courtyard in the late afternoon as the shadows lengthened across the grass, and the mountains went rose and purple in the fading light. And he told her more about the Texas operation, 12 years of building something in dry ground, the drought that had taken 3 years of good work in a single summer, the difficult decision to sell and start again. He spoke about it without bitterness, which she found admirable. She knew enough about loss and starting over to recognize a man who had done it without being broken by it. She told him about her father, and about inheriting the store, and about the first year when she had not known if she could make the finances work, and had sat up with the ledger books 3 nights running until she found the way through. She had not told this to many people, not because it was a secret, but because people in Harlan's Crossing had already formed their picture of her, and new information had difficulty finding a place in an established picture. He listened to this with the same quality of attention he gave everything, and when she finished he said quietly, You must have been terrified." "I was," she said, and the simple acknowledgement of that felt unexpectedly like a kind of relief. "But you found the way through." "I found the way through," she agreed. He looked at the house, at the walls that needed work and the windows that were going to be cut into the adobe and filled with good glass, and he said, "I think you are one of the most capable people I have met in this territory." She looked at her hands for a moment, at the ink stain on her right forefinger from the ledger pen, and she said, "People in this town think of me as reliable, which I suppose is a form of capable." "Reliable is a fine thing to be," he said, "but I meant capable. The difference is important." She looked at him, and he was looking at the house, not at her, and she was glad of that because she was not sure her face was doing anything she wanted it to be doing in that moment. They rode back to town in the warm, early evening, side by side on the dirt road, and the conversation came and went in the easy, unself-conscious way of people who have discovered they are comfortable in each other's presence. And by the time they reached the edge of town, Ella had made a firm private resolution to stop thinking about Amos Donovan in any way other than as a valued customer. The resolution lasted until the next morning, when she woke before dawn with his voice in her head, saying, "You are one of the most capable people I have met in this territory." And she lay in the dark above her store and felt the strange, inconvenient warmth of being genuinely seen by someone, and knew that the resolution was not going to hold. There followed 6 weeks of a thing that Ella refused to name for herself, because naming it felt reckless, and she was not, by nature or by practice, a reckless woman. He came into the store 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes for supplies and sometimes simply, it seemed, because he had reason to be in town and found that the dry goods store was a place where he could have a conversation worth having. He brought her a bunch of desert flowers once, the yellow blooms of the prickly pear, gathered carefully, and said only that they were growing along his fence line and he thought she might like them, and she put them in a glass jar on her counter and said thank you in a voice that was steadier than she felt. He helped her once when a delivery wagon arrived with barrels too heavy for her to move without assistance, and he did not make a production of it, did not perform helpfulness in a way that emphasized her need for it. He simply helped, efficiently and without commentary, and then washed his hands in her back basin and said he would see her Thursday about the timber delivery. He remembered details she told him, the name of her father, the fact that she preferred the morning for difficult work and left the simpler tasks for the afternoon, that she had grown up in this territory and knew it differently than someone who had arrived as an adult. The town noticed, as towns do. Martha Holt brought it up, with the careful delicacy of a woman who considers herself the responsible custodian of a friend's emotional welfare. "People are saying that Mr. Donovan spends a good deal of time in your store," she said, on a Wednesday morning in early October. "He is building a cattle operation," Ella said. "He needs a great deal of supplies. This is a supplies store." "Ella," Martha said, in the particular tone that meant she was setting aside the pretense of tactful indirection. Ella looked at her. "Martha, he looks at you in a way that is not about fence wire," Martha said. "People notice these things." Ella set down the bolt of cloth she was holding. "Martha, I am 36 years old." "I am aware of how old you are," Martha said. "I was at your birthday supper 3 years ago when your father was still alive and we made the peach cake." "What I mean," Ella said carefully, "is that I am not a young woman waiting for a man to notice her. I have a store. I have a life. And Mr. Donovan is a customer who has been courteous and respectful, and I have no reason to make more of that than it is." Martha looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "I am not saying you should make more of it than it is," she said. "I am saying that maybe it is already more than you are letting yourself see." Ella said nothing to that, and Martha did not press her, and the subject was left where it was, like a stone on a path that everyone had decided to walk around. That evening, Amos came into the store 20 minutes before she closed. He had come from the land, and there was adobe dust on his forearms and a particular tiredness in his face that she recognized as the productive kind, the tiredness of a man who has worked hard at something that is going the way he wants it to go. "I won't keep you," he said. "I need lamp oil. The work is taking longer in the evenings now that the days are shorter." She got the lamp oil and set it on the counter and began to write it in the ledger, and he leaned against the counter and said, "The first window went in yesterday, the west-facing one." She looked up. "How does it look?" "The light in the afternoon is extraordinary," he said. There was a quiet satisfaction in his voice that made her smile without intending to. "Good glass makes the difference," she said. "You were right about that." He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Beckett, I want to ask you something." The ledger pen went still in her hand. "Yes, there is a dance at the Grange Hall next Saturday," he said. "I have been told it is the social event of the autumn in this county, which may or may not be a high standard." He said this with the slight, self-deprecating humor that she had come to appreciate in him. "I would like very much if you would come with me." Ella set down the pen. She looked at the ledger, at her father's photograph on the wall, at the jar of desert flowers that had dried to a papery gold on the counter, and she thought about the town's quiet, collective removal of her from the ledger of romantic life, and she thought about what Martha Holt had said, and she thought about the west-facing window and the afternoon light and a man who built a house with windows not because he needed them but because a house ought to have light. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He exhaled, and she realized that he had been uncertain of her answer, which meant that whatever certainty she thought he had about her feelings was not as complete as she had assumed, and this was somehow the most reassuring thing she had learned about him yet. "Saturday, then," he said, and took the lamp oil, and the smile was in his eyes as much as on his mouth, and she watched him go and then stood very still in her empty store for a moment before she went back to the ledger. The dance at the Grange Hall was the social event of the autumn, as advertised. The building had been decorated with bunting in red and gold, and the women of the town had contributed pies and cakes to the long tables along the wall, and the Mendez brothers had their fiddles tuned up and were producing music that was lively enough to shake the dust from the rafters. The whole of Harlan's Crossing turned out, which in practical terms meant about 200 people, and the hall was warm and loud and smelled of beeswax candles and fried pie dough, and the particular kind of good-natured noise that frontier people made when they were briefly and collectively allowed to stop working and enjoy themselves. Ella had worn her good dress, the dark green one that had been a deliberate extravagance 3 years ago, and that she had worn perhaps 4 times since. She had let her hair down from its usual severe arrangement and put it up more loosely, and when she came downstairs and caught her reflection in the window glass of the store, she had looked at herself with the careful neutrality she tried to maintain about her own appearance, and she had thought, quietly and without vanity, that she looked like a woman who was going to a dance. Amos was waiting for her at the door of the Grange Hall. He was wearing a clean white shirt and a good black vest, and he had made some effort with his hair, and he looked up when she came across the street toward him, and she saw, clearly and unmistakably, the look on his face. Not the polite appreciation of a man who was performing the expected reaction, but the involuntary, unguarded look of a man who was genuinely pleased by what he saw and who had not quite managed to conceal it. "Miss Beckett," he said, and then simply, "You look wonderful." "Thank you," she said, and did not look away and did not deflect, which was its own small act of courage. They went inside together, and the town noticed immediately, the way towns do, a slight adjustment in the room's collective attention, a few exchanged glances, a visible recalibration among the women who had been engineering their daughter's proximity to Amos Donovan for the past 3 weeks. Ella was aware of it and did her best not to be self-conscious about it, and Amos, if he noticed, gave no indication. He danced with her twice before the intermission, a reel and a slower waltz that the Mendez brothers played with unexpected gentleness. And he was a good dancer, not showy but solid and deliberate, which she supposed was consistent with everything else about him. She had not danced in years and had expected to feel clumsy, but his lead was clear enough that she found herself simply moving and not thinking about the mechanics. And when the waltz ended and they stood for a moment in the brief silence before the next number started, they were close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the place where the sun had put a permanent color in his skin, and she felt the singular, terrifying awareness of wanting very much to be closer still. They sat together during the intermission and ate a piece of the peach pie that Mrs. Garza had contributed and drank cups of the tepid lemonade that was the hall's concession to festivity, and they talked about the land and the house and the cattle he was planning to bring up in the spring, and it was the most ordinary conversation, and she was more happy sitting there than she had been in a very long time. Sam Cutler, who ran the land office and considered himself the social conscience of the county, sat down across from them with the comfortable deliberateness of a man who has decided to say something that he believes needs saying. He was a blunt man, not unkind but not careful either. "Donovan," he said, "you ought to know something about this town." Amos looked at him with mild attention. "What's that?" Cutler glanced at Ella, then back at Amos. "Some things have been settled here for a while. People know where things stand is all. I just think a man who's new to a place ought to understand the arrangements." The sentence hung in the air like smoke, and Ella felt her jaw tighten, because she understood exactly what he was saying, and it required the full discipline of 36 years of being a contained and dignified person not to say so out loud in a way that would make the evening unpleasant. Amos looked at Cutler for a moment with the unhurried, thorough quality of his attention. "I appreciate you being friendly," he said, in a voice that was perfectly pleasant and entirely unintimidated. "But I don't think I need arrangements explained to me. I make my own mind up about things." Cutler looked momentarily taken aback, then nodded in the way men do when they have been politely but firmly declined and moved off to find more agreeable company. Ella looked at her lemonade. "You didn't have to say that," she said quietly. "I know I didn't have to," Amos said. "I said it because it was true." He paused. What was he trying to tell me? She looked at him. He met her eyes steadily, waiting. "He was trying to tell you," she said, "that the town has a settled opinion about me. That I am a fixture, a permanent, reliable, unmovable fixture, and that you should understand this before." She stopped. "Before what?" he asked. "Before you made any errors of judgment," she said, keeping her voice even. He was quiet for a moment, and the fiddles started up again across the hall. "Ella," he said, and it was the first time he had used her Christian name. It landed somewhere in her chest with a weight she had not expected. "The only error of judgment I can imagine making where you are concerned is not being honest with you soon enough about what I think." She looked at him and waited, because she was not going to help him with this, not going to offer him a word or a rescue or a comfortable out. Whatever he had to say, he was going to have to say it himself. "I think you are the most remarkable person in this town," he said, "and I think the town has been looking at you so long from such a familiar angle that they've stopped seeing you the way a person is actually meant to be seen. And I think," he stopped, seemed to consider, and then continued with the same quiet determination, "I think I would like very much to keep coming into your store, and not only for fence wire and lamp oil." She felt the smile come before she decided to let it. "What else would you be coming in for?" she asked. "The conversation," he said, "mostly, and the company." He picked up his cup. "And possibly the way you look when you are trying not to laugh at something." She laughed, which she supposed was the point, and the evening settled back into itself with something warmer and more settled in it than before. November came with a cold wind off the mountains and a frost that turned the desert grass silver in the mornings. Amos was deep in the work of the ranch. The house was beginning to take real shape. The fencing was coming along, and he had hired 2 additional hands, brothers named Vicent and Carlos Ruiz, who came with recommendations from a rancher in Doña Ana County, and who, it turned out, had the specific combination of skills and reliability that made them genuinely valuable rather than merely present. Ella heard this from Amos himself, who had developed the habit of telling her things, not because she needed to know them for business purposes, but because she was, as he put it once, the person he most wanted to tell. They took Sunday afternoon rides when the work and the weather allowed. She knew the territory in ways he was still learning, the wash that flooded unexpectedly in hard rain, the place where the road north became impassable in deep snow, the ranches and the homesteads and the complicated, layered social geography of who was allied with whom and who owed what to which. She shared this knowledge freely because it was useful to him, and because, she admitted to herself in the honest dark of her room, she liked having reasons to spend time with him. He was a thoughtful man. This was what she came back to, over and over. Not his strength or his competence or the way he looked in the afternoon light, though she was not indifferent to any of these things. He was thoughtful. He remembered things. He asked questions that were real questions, the kind that came from genuine curiosity rather than social obligation. He asked her once, on a Sunday ride along the edge of the creek that ran through the northwest corner of the Velasco land, what she had wanted to be when she was a girl. She looked at the water, at the winter light on it, and said, "I wanted to be a doctor." He was quiet, waiting. "My father said it was not a practical ambition for a girl in this territory. He was not wrong, exactly. He was being realistic." She paused. "I think he was also a little frightened of it because it would have taken me far away and he did not want to lose me. But I understood and I helped him in the store, and eventually the store became mine and I found things in it that satisfied me." She looked at him. "I became very good at diagnosis as it happens, just not of people." "What do you diagnose?" he asked. "Supply chains," she said, "and machinery, and the particular ways in which a building is about to fail." She smiled. "It is a less glamorous practice than medicine." "But important," he said. "Very important," she agreed, "especially to the people whose wagons are about to lose a wheel." He laughed, and then he said more quietly, "I think you could have been a doctor. I think you could be most things you decided to be." "I am 36, she said, and she said it without bitterness, as a plain fact. "I know how old you are," he said. "It is not a counter-argument." She looked at him. He was watching the creek, his horse standing easy beneath him. He said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had simply calculated and found the answer straightforward. And she felt something shift in her chest, that she was no longer trying to pretend she did not feel. December arrived, and with it a cold, bright spell that turned the desert crystalline and made the mountains look close enough to touch. The timber she had ordered from the Cruces mill had been delivered, and the good glass windows were in, and the adobe house on the Velasco land was beginning to look, unmistakably, like a home. She had been out to see it twice more, ostensibly to assess further supply needs, and both times she had stood in the west-facing room in the afternoon and watched the light come through the window and felt the particular ache of a beautiful thing being made in the world. On the third visit, he had cooked supper. She had not expected this, had come to discuss a list of remaining interior work, and found instead a fire in the freshly plastered hearth and a cast-iron pot of beef stew on the table and bread that he had made himself, and that was, to her considerable surprise, genuinely good. "You cook," she said. "I lived alone for 12 years, he said. "You learn or you don't eat." They ate at the rough table in the main room with the fire going and the wind off the mountains pressing against the walls and the new glass panes. And it was domestic and quiet, and so unexpectedly right that Ella had to discipline herself quite sternly to stop thinking in the particular direction that everything seemed to be moving. After supper they sat by the fire and he told her about his family, a mother who had died young, a father who had ranched in West Texas and taught him the land, a younger sister in San Antonio who was married to a schoolteacher, and had 2 children Amos described with such evident, uncomplicated love that Ella had to look at the fire rather than at him. "Do you want children?" he asked, and the directness of it, the way he simply asked, in the tone he used for all direct questions, as though the question were as practical as asking about timber costs made her breath catch. She looked at the fire. I thought for a long time that it was not a question I needed to have an opinion about. And now? Now I think, she stopped, then said carefully, I think I have been very careful for a very long time not to want things I did not expect to have. The fire popped and settled. What if you had reason to expect them? He asked. She looked at him then, and he met her eyes with the direct, steady quality that was simply how he looked at things, and she felt the full weight of the moment, all the weeks and the rides and the conversations and the desert flowers in the glass jar, and the dance and the way he had said I make my own mind up about things to Sam Cutler, all of it collected in this room with the firelight on the walls and the wind outside. Amos, she said. I know I am moving quickly, he said. I am aware of that. But I am also 40 years old, and I have lived long enough to know when something is worth being honest about. He was quiet for a moment. I have thought about very little besides you since October. I want you to know that. The town will have opinions, she said, and she was not sure why she said it except that she was being honest too. The town always has opinions, he said. I am not interested in marrying the town's opinion of you. She stared at him. The word marry had come out of the sentence very quietly and very clearly, and the fire was warm and the wind was outside and she was 36 years old and the town had, she knew very well, quietly stopped expecting anything of this nature for her, and this man had quite genuinely not heard that, or had heard it and found it entirely irrelevant. Are you? She began. I am asking if you will marry me, he said, with the calm of a man who has decided to be honest and has passed the point of being nervous about it. Not today, not next week. I am asking if it is something you are willing to consider. He paused. I am asking because I want a life that includes you in it, and I would like to know if you want that too. The fire settled again into its own quiet crackling. The wind pressed against the windows. The light in the room was amber and warm, and Ella Beckett looked at this man who had arrived in Harlan's Crossing on a bay horse in the early autumn and walked into her store without knowing anything about the ledger the town had quietly placed her in, and she felt the solid, terrifying reality of wanting something she had trained herself not to want. I am willing to consider it, she said, and her voice was steady and her eyes were bright. I am more than willing to consider it. He breathed, and the tension that had been holding him careful and still across the table released, and he reached across and put his hand over hers on the table, a touch as clear and deliberate as everything he did, and said, All right, we'll take the time we need. She turned her hand over beneath his and felt the warmth of his palm against hers, and thought that 36 was an excellent age to discover that she had been wrong about the things she allowed herself to want. Christmas came to Harlan's Crossing with a cold wind and a light snow that dusted the desert and made the town look briefly, improbably pastoral. Ella had decorated the store with a wreath of juniper and kept a small pot-bellied stove running for the comfort of her customers, and she sold more in the weeks before Christmas than in any comparable period in her 3 years of running the store, which was satisfying in the way that good business always was. She and Amos attended the Christmas service at the little white church together, which was an act whose social significance was not lost on a single person in the county. They sat side by side in the third pew and shared a hymnal, and the minister gave a sermon about hope and new beginnings that was probably not specifically directed at them, but that Ella noticed seemed to land with particular emphasis on several people in the congregation who were looking discreetly in their direction. After the service, in the churchyard with the light snow coming down and the mountains white above the town, Martha Holt grabbed Ella's arm and said, in a fierce whisper, I told you. You told me nothing useful, Ella said. I told you it was more than you were letting yourself see, Martha said, beaming with the unabashed delight of a woman who has been right about something she cared about. That is the most useful thing I have ever told anyone. Ella laughed, and Amos, who was talking to the minister nearby, glanced over at the sound of her laugh with a look on his face that Martha immediately catalogued and reported to her husband at supper that evening, as the single most telling thing she had observed in the county in recent memory. January was cold, and the work at the ranch slowed as it always did in deep winter. But Amos came into town more frequently in these months, and the evenings they spent together, sometimes at the Grange Hall when there was some community gathering, sometimes simply in the back room of her store with tea and the lamp lit, and the ledger books open on the table between conversation, had become a fact of both their lives in the way that solid, genuine things become facts. They were not formal about it. There was no announced courtship, no public declaration. They were simply, visibly together in the way of two people who have found each other and have not seen any good reason to pretend otherwise. On a cold February evening, he came to the store as she was closing up and sat on the stool behind the counter while she put the ledger away, and he said, "I had a letter from my sister in San Antonio." "What does she say?" Ella asked. "She asks whether I am serious about you," he said. "I wrote to her about you in November." She looked at him. "What did you write?" "I wrote that I had met a woman who was the most genuinely capable and extraordinary person in the New Mexico territory, and that I was doing my best not to rush things in a way that would alarm her." He said this with his characteristic directness, and Ella felt the warmth of it settle through her like good medicine. "She writes back to say that she would very much like to meet you, and that she hopes I am not being an idiot." "She sounds like a sensible woman," Ella said. "She is the most sensible woman I know," he said. "Until November she was." He paused. "She wants to come in the spring to meet you." Ella held very still. "To meet me?" "Yes, Amos," she said. "If your sister is coming to meet me, I think we ought to settle the question of whether there is something definitive for her to come and meet me about." He looked at her for a moment, and then he stood up from the stool and came around the counter to where she was standing, and he took both of her hands in his. He looked at her in the way he always looked at things, thoroughly and without hurry, and then he said, "Ella Beckett, I love you. I have loved you since you told me that whoever said this was the best supplied store between here and Las Cruces had either been flattering you or hadn't been to Cruces recently. And I want to marry you, if you will have me." She felt the words go through her like the light through the good glass window, clear and warm and completely uncomplicated. She thought of the town, and the ledger she had been placed in, and the quiet collective removal of her from the category of woman who might still be reached by love, and she felt a profound and grateful disregard for all of it. "I will have you," she said. "Yes." He put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her with the same deliberate warmth that characterized everything he did, and she kissed him back without any of the practiced restraint she had applied to most things in her adult life. And when they stepped apart, the store was very quiet around them, and the lamp was warm, and the desert outside the window was silver and cold. "I should speak to whoever one speaks to," he said. "You have no father. I am 36 years old," she said. "You speak to me, and we are having that conversation now." He smiled, the full smile, not the edge of it. "Fair enough," he said. They told the town in the way things were always told in towns like Harlan's Crossing, not by announcement, but by being seen together with the ring she had chosen from the modest selection at the jeweler in Cruces, a simple gold band with a small set turquoise stone that she had chosen herself because it was beautiful and practical, and because turquoise had been in this land longer than any of them. When Martha Holt saw it, she made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely, and she hugged Ella with a fierceness that surprised them both. Sam Cutler tipped his hat to Amos on the street and said nothing at all, which in the language of the frontier was a variety of apology and was accepted as such. The wedding was in April, which was the right month for it. The desert was showing its brief, extravagant spring beauty, the yellow flowers on the prickly pear and the blue of the lupins and the warm, sweet air coming off the mountains. They married in the small white church where they had sat together at Christmas, with the minister who had given the sermon about hope, and about 30 people came, which was most of the people in Harlan's Crossing that mattered to either of them. Martha Holt was there with her husband and her 3 children, and a new one on the way. Vicente and Carlos Ruiz came in their good clothes. The Mendez brothers played, because there was, of course, a celebration after at the Grange Hall, and the dancing went until nearly midnight, and Ella danced more that night than she had danced in a decade. Amos's sister Clara had come from San Antonio, a bright, dark-eyed woman of 32 with her husband Thomas, the schoolteacher, and their 2 children, and she had arrived 2 days before the wedding, and within an hour had told Ella in the clear, affectionate way of a woman who does not bother with circumlocution that she was exactly what she had hoped her brother would find, and she was very glad he had not been an idiot. "He said you were remarkable," Clara said. "He was understating." "He tends to understate," Ella said. "He does," Clara agreed. "You'll have to account for that." They had laughed together, and Ella felt the particular warmth of being received into a family by someone who genuinely meant it. They spent the wedding night at the ranch house, her house now, with the good glass windows and the west-facing light. And in the morning she stood in the room with the light coming through the window in the way it had come through it the first time she had stood there. And she thought of the woman who had stood in this room in October and not allowed herself to want anything. And she felt a gratitude so large and so uncomplicated that it was almost like the silence of the desert. Spring moved into summer, and the ranch came alive in the way that land comes alive when the right hands are working it and the right decisions are being made. Amos brought the cattle up from Texas in June, 120 head of good longhorns, and Vicen and Carlos proved their worth in the difficult weeks of settling the herd onto new range. There were long days, and there was hard work, and there were problems with the north fence, and a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Prout about the water rights to a secondary creek that required the full weight of Ella's organizational competence, and a sharp letter to the county land office, written in her careful hand, that settled the matter decisively in their favor. She kept the store. She had never considered not keeping it, and Amos had never suggested she should. It was hers. It had been her father's and then hers, and it was the means of her knowledge and her capability and her independence. And these were not things she had any intention of setting aside simply because she had acquired a husband. What changed was not the store but the texture of her life. The fact that she came home to him in the evenings, that there was a fire in the hearth and a man who asked her about her day and listened to the answer, that she was no longer the single woman above the dry goods store but a person living fully inside a life she had built and was continuing to build. He was a good husband in the ways that mattered, not perfect, which she had not asked for and would not have known what to do with, but good. He was patient and direct, and he made room for her opinions and her stubbornness and her tendency to work until the problem was solved rather than until it was time to stop working. He had a temper that showed itself occasionally in the face of genuine frustration, a bad piece of equipment, a difficult animal, a man who was being deliberately dishonest. And when it did, she found she did not find it alarming, because it was honest and proportionate and was followed reliably by a kind of focused calm that resolved things. She found herself easier in her own temper in his company. She had not known she had been keeping a kind of internal tension, the constant management of solitude, the discipline of being entirely self-sufficient, the vigilance of a woman who relies on no one until she was no longer keeping it, and the release was subtle and pervasive and good. In August, she knew she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before telling him, not from any anxiety about his response, but because she wanted to be sure of it first. She was 36 years old, and she was not going to build her heart on an uncertainty. When she was sure, she told him in the morning, before either of them had begun the day's work, and she watched his face do something she had never seen it do before, the contained, thorough man opening up, just briefly, into something enormous and unguarded and full. He pulled her to him and held her for a long, quiet moment, and she felt his breathing change and steady again, and he said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "We will need to speak to the doctor in Cruces," he said. "I intend to," she said. "And you should not be lifting, Amos," she said. with the particular tone she used when his practicality was in danger of running ahead of everything else. "Right," he said. He pulled back enough to look at her face, and his eyes were very clear and very bright. "Are you frightened?" She considered the question with the honesty she always tried to apply to questions that deserved it. "A little," she said. "I am 36. "I know," he said. "We will be careful, and you are strong and sensible, and you have never, in my knowledge of you, let a practical problem defeat you." "A baby is not a practical problem," she said. "No," he agreed. "But everything around a baby can be managed practically, and we will manage it." He touched her face. "And I will be here for all of it." The doctor in Cruces was a careful, experienced man named Dr. Mendelsohn, who had delivered babies in the territory for 20 years and who examined Ella with professional thoroughness and told her she was in excellent health and that the pregnancy was progressing well, and that, while it was true that a first pregnancy at 36 carried certain additional considerations, there was no reason to expect anything other than a good outcome. He was direct and competent, and Ella liked him immediately, which she told Amos afterward, and Amos said he had rather counted on that. They drove back to Harlan's Crossing in the wagon with the late summer air warm and gold around them and the mountains in their best colors, and Ella sat beside Amos on the wagon seat and felt the country around her, the land she had known all her life, the mountains and the desert and the long roads between things. And she felt it differently now, the way you feel a thing when it has been re-inhabited by love. Winter came again, the second winter, and the baby grew and Ella's body changed and the store remained open, and she hired a young woman named Petra Sandoval to help with the heavier work 3 days a week. And Petra turned out to be sharp and willing and quick with numbers, which meant that the store ran smoothly, and Ella could sit down when she needed to without worrying about what was being left undone. Clara came again from San Antonio in January, because she had said she wanted to be there, and she was a woman who did what she said she would do, and having her in the house was unexpectedly wonderful. She was practical and warm, and she took over the cooking with a cheerful authority that gave Ella permission to rest without feeling that she was failing at anything. The baby came on a clear February morning, with Dr. Mendelsohn in attendance and Amos downstairs and Clara in the room, and the good glass windows full of winter light. He was a boy, healthy and loud, and with his father's sage-green eyes, which was the first thing Clara announced when she carried him to the doorway. And the sound that came from downstairs when Amos heard that was the kind of sound that made Clara laugh and Ella cry, gently, with a happiness so full it felt like astonishment. They named him James, for Ella's father, James Nathaniel Donovan, and he was brought home to the ranch house 3 days later, wrapped in a blanket that Clara had made herself, and laid in the cradle that Amos had built in the fall with his own hands from good pine wood, working in the evenings with the lamp lit, and the concentrated care of a man making something that needed to be right. The life they settled into then was full and demanding and more satisfying than anything Ella had known how to expect. The store did well. Petra Sandoval, who turned out to have a genuine gift for the work, became a full partner in its management, and the letters and supply negotiations that had once been solely Ella's province were shared now in a way that freed Ella's time without diminishing her authority or her knowledge. She was at the store in the mornings, 3 or 4 days a week, and the rest of the time she was at the ranch. And the ranch and the store together made up the world they had built, which was a good world and a real one. James was a sturdy, cheerful child who walked early and talked early and showed, at the age of 2, a fascination with the horses that made Amos quietly triumphant in the way fathers are when their children confirm their most private hopes. He toddled after Vicent and Carlos in the yard, and was received by both men with the elaborate gravity of people who understand that a small child's dignity is a matter of real importance. And Ella watched this sometimes from the porch, and felt the particular happiness of seeing the specific texture of the life you are living. The third autumn brought news from Clara that she was expecting a third child, and the letter was full of her characteristic brightness. And Ella wrote back a letter that was also full of brightness, and that included a detailed list of practical recommendations from her own recent experience, which Clara appreciated enormously. She was in the store on a Tuesday in October, 3 years, almost exactly, since Amos had first pushed open the door with his particular step and his careful eyes, when a man she did not recognize came in and asked for fence wire, and she went to show him the stock the way she had gone to show Amos 3 years ago, and she thought of this as she measured it out, the specific impossible improbability of the chain of events that had connected that morning to this one. She was 39 now, and the store was busier than it had been, and the ranch was well established, and James was a solid, laughing 3-year-old, and Amos was Amos. He was the man who had come in for fence wire and stayed for everything else, and he was the man who brought her coffee in the morning when she was deep in the ledger books, and the man who rode beside her on Sunday afternoons when there was time, and the man who still looked at her with the same quality of looking that had been the first thing she had noticed about him, thorough and honest and entirely his own. And she was the woman who had stood at her window on her 36th birthday and not expected anything more than what she had, and had been so magnificently wrong about what was possible that she still felt, occasionally, a kind of stunned gratitude at the simple fact of it. In the late October of that year, she told Amos in the morning over coffee that she was pregnant again, and he looked at her across the table with the same enormous, unguarded thing opening in his face that she had seen the first time, and he reached across and took her hand and said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said, for the second time. "Good," he said. And then, after a moment, "James will be pleased." "James is 3, she said. "He will be pleased about anything that arrives and can be shown to the horses." Amos laughed, and James, hearing the sound, came barreling in from the next room in the determined way he had of going toward things that interested him, and climbed onto the bench beside his father and looked between them with the bright-eyed attention of a child who understands that something is happening without knowing what. "Papa and I have news," Ella told him. "Good news or going-to-bed news?" he asked, which was his classification for information that required action on his part. "The best kind," Ella said. He considered this seriously. "Like the time the new colt came." "Something like that," Amos said, and met Ella's eyes over their son's head with a warmth that was the accumulated warmth of 3 years of mornings and evenings and difficult days and good ones, and she held his gaze and felt the solidness of everything they had made together, the store and the ranch and the family and the specific, irreplaceable fact of their life. The second baby was born in the following June, with Dr. Mendelsohn again in attendance and Clara again in residence, who had made the trip from San Antonio with her own newest child strapped to her chest, and her usual magnificent competence deployed on behalf of the kitchen. The baby was a girl this time. Amos's sage-green eyes again, which was becoming something of a Donovan pattern, and a quantity of dark hair that was very clearly her mother's. They named her Ruth, for a quiet reason that Ella held privately and simply Ruth, who had said, "Wherever you go, I will go," which was the kind of love she believed in and the kind of life she was living. James, who was now 4, examined his sister with the serious scientific attention that he applied to all new phenomena, and declared her acceptable, which was, Clara said, the most gracious reception any small child had ever extended to an usurping sibling, and Amos said he would tell James that when he was older, and they all laughed together in the warm kitchen of the adobe house with the good glass windows and the west-facing light. That evening, after the children were asleep and Clara had retired and the house was quiet, Ella sat on the front porch of the ranch house with Amos beside her, and the night sky above the desert doing what the night sky in New Mexico does in June, going enormous and black and blazing with stars in a way that makes all human calculation seem both very small and very precious. She was 39 years old and she had a store she had built from her father's legacy, and a husband who had come in for fence wire, and 2 children sleeping inside, and a house with good glass windows full of morning light, and a life that was demanding and difficult and more full than she had known how to want. "What are you thinking about?" Amos asked. She looked at the stars for a moment. "October," she said. "Which October?" "3 years ago," she said. "I was standing at my window on my birthday and the town had made its mind up about me." She paused. "I had made my mind up about me in certain ways." He was quiet, listening. "And then you came in for fence wire," she said, "and you had not heard what anyone had made up their mind about, and so you just proceeded." "I proceeded," he agreed, with a slight warmth in his voice that was his particular variety of amusement. "Is that how you think of it?" "How do you think of it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars with the same quality he had always given to the things he looked at. "I think of it as the first good decision I made when I came to this territory," he said. "I made a number of good decisions, the land, the hands, the cattle, but the first one and the best one was going into your store." "You came in for fence wire," she said. "I came in for fence wire," he agreed. "And I found considerably more than I was looking for." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was a thing she had been doing for 3 years and still felt like a choice she was making rather than a habit, a daily decision in favor of the specific solidity of him. He put his arm around her, and they sat in the warm June dark with the stars burning and the desert breathing around them and the children asleep inside. And the life they had made together settled around them like a thing that had always been going to be and was simply, finally, here. The ranch grew over the years that followed in the way good things grow, steadily, without drama, by accumulation. Amos brought in more cattle the following spring and hired 2 more hands, and the operation that had begun with 120 longhorns became a respectable and well-regarded concern. Vicent Ruiz married a woman from Doña Ana County, and they built a small house on the eastern edge of the property, which became a permanent arrangement by tacit and mutual agreement, and their children grew up alongside James and Ruth with the easy familiarity of children who have always known each other. Ella expanded the store in the 4th year, bought the adjacent property from the widow Hatch, who was moving to live with her daughter in Albuquerque, and knocked through the wall to make a second room that she devoted to heavier goods and agricultural supplies, which meant she could carry more stock and serve the farms and ranches that had been going to Cruces for things she could now provide locally. Petra Sandoval managed the new section with the same competent authority she had been applying to the original store, and Ella spent 1 evening a week going over the books with her in the back room, and felt the particular satisfaction of having built something that would continue and grow. James turned 7 and started at the territorial school that had been established on the eastern edge of town, and took to reading with such absorbed enthusiasm that Ella found books competing with horses for his attention, which she considered a very promising development. Ruth was 3, then 4, then 5, and was a child of bright opinions and considerable stubbornness, who had apparently inherited her mother's capacity for absolute positions on matters of principle and her father's directness in expressing them, and who Amos regarded with an admiration barely concealed under parental gravity. Clara and Thomas brought the family to visit every other year, and these visits were the reliable pleasure of both households. Clara's children and Ella's children organized themselves into a temporary tribe that commandeered the yard and the stable and a good portion of the surrounding desert, and the adults sat together in the evenings with good food and good talk, and the accumulation of years that had made them genuinely fond of one another in the way that only honest time can produce. In the autumn of their 5th year together, there was a dispute with the neighboring Prout family that was more serious than the earlier water rights matter, and required the engagement of a lawyer from Las Cruces. The dispute concerned a section of the northern fence line, and a claim of adverse possession that Prout had been quietly building evidence for, and it was ugly and stressful in the way that land disputes in the territory always were. The potential loss was real, and the process was slow, and the meetings in the land office had a particular texture of institutional difficulty that made Ella's jaw tight every time they walked out of one. She handled most of the documentation herself, working with the Las Cruces lawyer, a serious young man named Enriquez who was exactly as competent as he needed to be. And she organized the evidence with the precision she brought to her ledger books, and found 3 written records that established the original boundary clearly enough to make Pruitt's claim untenable. The matter was resolved in their favor at the beginning of December, and Amos came home from the final land office meeting and found her in the kitchen starting supper and said, "It's done," and she set down the pot and let out a breath that had been quietly accumulating for 4 months. "Enriquez was very good," she said. "Enriquez was adequate," Amos said. "The documentation you organized was very good." She looked at him. "You are biased." "I am married to you," he said. "The bias is informed." They celebrated with the good wine that Petra Sandoval's husband brought up from the south occasionally on his trade routes. Not the cheap stuff, the real article, smooth and dark. And they sat by the fire with James already asleep and Ruth told once more to be asleep and probably actually asleep, because she had the good sense to pick her battles. And they talked about the years and the work and the things that had been difficult and the things that had been good. And the ratio, they agreed, was satisfactory. "More than satisfactory," Amos said. "Yes," she agreed. "More than." The fire burned and the December wind pressed against the good glass windows and the house was warm, and she thought with the particular gratitude she tried to hold honestly rather than sentimentally, about what it meant to be in a life that was actual and full and built, a life that she had not, 3 years and more ago, allowed herself to imagine in its full dimensions. She was 40 now, Ella Beckett, who had been Ella Beckett, and was now Ella Donovan, though she kept both names in the world because the store had always been Beckett's and always would be. 40, and there was more life ahead than behind, or at least that was what she chose to believe, because she had discovered that belief in good things was not the naive choice she had trained herself to resist. It was, rather, the accurate acknowledgement of what was real and possible when you stopped maintaining such careful limits around your own hope. She had her store. She had her ranch and her husband and her children. She had Clara's letters and Petra Sandoval's dependable good sense and Martha Holt, who had 4 children now and still came in on Wednesday mornings and still looked at Ella with warm, proprietary satisfaction, as though she had personally arranged the whole business. She had the desert and the mountains and the west-facing window and the morning light through good glass. She had, in short, everything, and not despite being 36 when it started, but in some way she could not fully articulate and did not try to because of it. Because she had been the woman who knew her own mind and ran her own store and had spent enough years in her own company to know exactly what she valued. And so when he arrived, in his worn hat with his careful eyes, asking for fence wire, she had not been confused about it. She had been afraid of it, and then she had chosen it anyway. And that choice had been the right one, and she knew it with the unambiguous certainty of a woman who has had enough experience to know the difference between right and merely comfortable. On a warm spring morning in their 6th year, she opened the store before anyone else was on the street and stood in the doorway with her coffee and looked at Harlan's Crossing as the early sun put its amber and rose light across the facades of the buildings and the dust of the street. The road runner was in its usual place, darting under the saloon boardwalk, and the mountains were clear and close in the preheat air of the morning, and the desert was showing its brief spring color, the yellow of the prickly pear and the purple of the desert sage. She heard hooves and looked up to see Amos coming down the main street on his good bay horse, not the original bay, which had been retired to grass on the eastern pasture, but a younger one of the same solid type that he had a preference for. He was coming from the ranch and had, she knew, Been out since dawn checking the stock after a cold night. And he rode easy and straight in the saddle the way he always did. He saw her in the doorway and altered course and came to the boardwalk and leaned down from the saddle and said, "Good morning." "Good morning," she said. "Cattle are fine. The north fence held." He took the coffee she held up to him with a kind of ease that was only possible when two people have established the particular fluency of long familiarity. "James is awake and asking whether he can ride out with me this afternoon." "He can if his schoolwork is done," she said. "That is what I told him," he said. "He said it would definitely be done." "It will be done," she agreed. "He is very motivated by horses." "Useful quality in a rancher," Amos said. "He may not be a rancher," she said. "He may be something else." "He may be," Amos agreed. "But the horses will be useful either way." He drank the coffee and handed back the cup and looked down at her in the morning light with the same quality of looking that had always characterized him: full attention, honest and unhurried, and he said, "You look well." "I am well," she said. "Good," he said, and the word had the same weight it always had from him, simple and absolute, the statement of a man for whom things being good was the most important possible information. He gathered the reins and then said, "I'll come in for the flower order later, and possibly for other reasons." "I'll be here," she said. He touched the brim of his worn hat and turned the horse and rode back down the main street of Harlan's Crossing, and Ella stood in the doorway of Beckett's Dry Goods and watched him go and felt, with the full, uncomplicated weight of it, how very much she loved him, and how very strange and wonderful it was that this was the life she was actually living. She turned back into the store, into the smell of dry goods and lamp oil, and the order she had built from her father's legacy and her own work. And she pulled her ledger from beneath the counter and opened it to the current accounts and picked up her pen. And she began the morning's work with the same deliberate, satisfied competence she had brought to every morning of her working life, and with something more now, something that had been added and could not be removed, the permanent, specific color of a life that was genuinely, completely her own. The sun came up over the San Andres Mountains and poured through the front windows of the store, and Ella Donovan bent her dark head over her ledger and wrote, and the day began.